Hello, you. You're listening to A History of Italy. Episode 180, The Challenge of Barletta, 1503.
E così ritorno su, lascio i colli nelle valli, tra due salici piangenti, io ritrovo la speranza di un amore che ormai fu.
If you have the pleasure of visiting the beautiful Italian region of Puglia in the town of Barletta, you will find an osteria, a tavern by the name of Cantina della Sfida, which dates back to the late 1400s. Back then it had another name, for the name it bears now is inspired by an event that would not occur until 1503. Indeed, the word sfida means challenge, and the challenge it refers to is the famous Challenge of Barletta. Now, I say that dramatically, but you may be thinking, what now? The challenge of where? At the time it happened, and for at least 450 years after, it was a very big deal in Italy. It resounded somewhat inaccurately as a great moment of national Italian pride at a time in which Italy was under foreign domination and would be for centuries. It was made particularly famous by a member of the Italian Risorgimento, the political, cultural, and military movement that led to the unification of Italy in 1861. This person was Massimo d'Azeglio, who, in 1833, published a historical novel entitled Ettore Fieramosca and the Challenge of Barletta. Sadly, it was also used as a source of national Italian pride by Mussolini's fascist regime, who had a film version made in 1938 after an original in 1915. You can find them online. So, what was the Challenge of Barletta, and who was Ettore Fieramosca, which translates into Hector Proudfly? Well, the challenge from a military standpoint was a rather minor affair on the background of the Second Italian War. It was a duel, a question of honor, to avenge an insult at a time when honor was everything. A huge testosterone-fueled issue over whose was bigger. In the sense of lances, the Italian lances were longer, by the way. Let's first go back a bit and follow the steps of the hero, Ettore. He was born in 1477 to minor nobility. His father, Rinaldo, was good friends with a certain Bosio da Monreale, who had a little girl called Ginevra, Guinevere. The two children, growing up together, eventually fell in love. It was not to be. After receiving a humanist education, Ettore's father started him on the military career, beginning with an experience as a page at the court of King Ferrante of Naples, and he was very good at it. By the age of 14 in 1493, he had already been assigned the command of a contingent of mounted crossbowmen. As far as our love story goes, when Ettore left for his military career, Ginevra supposedly gave him a blue scarf that he would wear for the rest of his life. He then fought for Naples against Charles VIII of France in 1495, and then was back in the service of Naples after the restoration of the Neapolitan kings. We met Ettore during the second phase of the Italian Wars, when the invading French king was Louis XII, and this time Louis was allied with the Spanish, who were also in on the invasion. Ettore defended his native Capua from the French, commanded by Cesare Borgia, but the city eventually fell. He was starting to accumulate reasons not to like the French and Borgia. It is in this period that the love story with Ginevra met a tragic end. Ginevra and Ettore happened to be in Rome at the same time, and Ginevra caught the eye of Cesare Borgia. Despite the continuation of they will, they won't they, Ross and Rachel kind of thing with Ettore, she still loved him and refused Borgia's advances. Also maybe because she didn't fancy Cesare in any case. Borgia was not one to take no for an answer. As with many mysterious deaths around the Borgias, it was not definitively proven, but Cesare Borgia may have poisoned Ginevra di Monreale. In any case, a few days after a dinner in which Cesare and Ginevra had both been present, she fell ill and died. Ettore was devastated. Yet this is not a story of personal revenge. Ettore probably never saw Borgia again, and although he outlived Borgia and got to hear of his downfall, there would be no dramatic revenge scene. With regard to the French instead, maybe there could be a little revenge. The year was early 1503. The whole agreement between France and Spain over the division of the Kingdom of Naples, as probably everyone expected, had fallen apart, and war had broken out between the two. There was a moment of stalemate. The French seemed to have the upper hand at the moment, and the Spanish, commanded by Gonzalo de Córdoba, were holed up in Puglia, in the city of Barletta. Without any real fighting going on, the armies were getting bored, and a whole series of duels would break out over insults to each other's honour. Now, generally duels were legal and regulated, but so many illegal ones popped up that orders had been issued against them, and soldiers were even executed for organising them. There was also a series of raids and minor skirmishes, and one such took place near the Puglia town of Canosa. A Spanish contingent, led by Captain Diego da Mendoza, had come across a French contingent led by Charles de Torque, also known as Guy De La Motte. The Spanish got the better of them, and the French were captured. As chivalry required, Gonzalo de Córdoba organized a banquet in honor of the French captives. The dinner began with all the usual courtesies, in which the Spanish lauded the skill of the French soldiers, who at the time were considered the best knights in the world, considering the whole knightly literature business and the chanson de geste and Charlemagne and the Normans and all that. As well as the compliments for the French, the Spanish added that the Italians at the time were also very good, such as that Ettore Fieramosca, for example. Perhaps even better than the French. De La Motte was not standing for that. He responded that the Italians treated their weapons with nor art nor faith. Ooh, burn. Maybe he said some other stuff which is a bit more dirty, and he also added that the Italians were cowards and ran away from battles. Kind of true, because up until the French invasions, battles were just sort of maneuvers, but beside the point. The Spanish told him to cool it, and he was lucky that Fieramosca wasn't there, to which La Motte answered he would be glad to repeat his statement. He was then told that the Italians would demand satisfaction, to which he answered, then I shall give it to them." The Italians did find out, and they did demand an apology, and when none was forthcoming, the wheels were set in motion for perhaps the most famous duel in Italian history. It was to be 13 French knights versus 13 Italian knights. The condottieri, Fabrizio and Prospero Colonna, were in charge of recruiting the Italian team, and they had no trouble at all finding people. Quite the contrary, they had to turn back many volunteers. In the end, they decided on the 13 with a good mix representing many areas of Italy, Sicily, Naples, Rome, and also northern Italian knights. We won't go through the whole list, but I know that in the US in particular there is a great interest in tracing family trees, so I've put the list on the show notes. Who knows, you, my dear constant listener, may descend from one of the heroes of Barletta. We also have the names of the French, of whom we will mention, as well as Guy de la Motte, Claude Graillan from Asti, which at the time was considered French, or at least belonging to the French allies, the Savoy. But today, Asti is in the Piedmont region. That's why he was later considered by Massimo d'Azeglio, when he wrote his novel in 1833, to be a traitor. We know quite a lot of detail, where each team slept and had mass, but the important thing is that on the afternoon of the 13th of February, 1503, they showed up for the duel. The quarter-of-a-mile area was marked out with stands along one end, and if you went out of the designated area, you were disqualified. This was to avoid the duel going gallivanting all over the countryside. There were 4 judges for the Italians and 4 for the French, with 2 hostages per side. The winners, as well as the horses and armour of the losers, would also get 100 ducats per night, which each side was supposed to bring them to hand over after the duel. The Italians arrived on the scene first, and Ettore made a speech in which he asked his men, like himself, to die rather than surrender. They were taking this whole thing rather seriously. Then the French showed up, and De La Motte made an Asterix and Obelix style speech about kicking out the Romans. What have the Romans ever done for us, kind of thing. The Italians allowed the French to choose the side of the field which left the Italians facing the sun at the same time that a strong wind was sending dust swirling. The two signs lined up on horseback and awaited the signal. 1 trumpet blast, 2, 3, and they were off. The two sides moved in towards each other, lances set, a little slowly at first. Then, when they were within 20 paces, they sped up. Suddenly, the French split into 2 wings, hoping to flank the Italians. Fieramosca was not taken by surprise, and he ordered his line to do the same. The two lines meeting head-on. Due to the relatively limited speed of the first charge, the first clash was not too violent. There was a lot of pushing and shoving and positioning and so on, but all participants soon found that the close proximity and the wind made using lances complicated. The combatants switched to swords, the Italians having chosen axes. After the first charge, the French seemed a bit disoriented and the Italians took advantage immediately, and the situation very quickly turned in their favour. One of the few Italians to be knocked off his horse was the Neapolitan Giovanni Capoccio. His horse's face was slashed, but he was not deterred. He jumped off the horse as it fell, and despite no longer being mounted, managed to chase one French knight out of bounds and score a violent blow to the head of another. The knight was the aforementioned Claude Gaillan d'Asti, considered the traitor. The blow was so violent that, according to one chronicler, blood and brains were oozing out of his nose. Gaillan was the only death at the challenge of Barletta. In perfect film style, Guy De La Motte, the captain of the French side and the one who had launched the insult that started the whole thing, was marked during the fighting and eventually hunted down by Ettore Fieramosca himself. In a less dramatic development, he simply pushed the French knight out of bounds. Indeed, of the only 4 Italians who were eliminated, it seems that at least 2 were due to excess enthusiasm in chasing out their adversaries and going out of bounds themselves. Not everyone was pushed out of bounds, some surrendered, some were wounded to the point that they could no longer continue. In the end, 1 French knight was left, Charles de Pierre, ferociously and desperately fighting off the 9 remaining Italians, 7 of whom were still on horseback, asking him to surrender. In the end, the judges had to drag Pierre out to avoid him being killed. It had all been over in just under an hour. The Italians had won the day. They took a victory lap, and when the enthusiasm died down, they went to get their spoils. They got the French horses and weapons. Then, of course, it was time to cash in on the money. That is where things hit a snag. Those cocky French knights had been so convinced that they were going to win the duel that they had not brought the money with them. That meant that the Italians had the right to keep the French captives until the money was paid, meaning that they had the extra perk of parading the French knights in shame back to Barletta. The debt was paid and the prisoners were released 4 days later. Honour was important, and a loss like this would have been a great blow to morale, something both armies wanted to avoid as much as possible. The Italians had upheld their honour and proven themselves in battle, a great shining moment in the darkness that was coming of centuries of occupation. It also showed that, although a political and military concept of a united Italy was unthinkable, there was a concept of being Italian as opposed to French or Spanish. There was a cultural Italy without a nation. There was a promise of Italy that would take centuries to fulfill. Thank you very much, my dear listener, for listening. A History of Italy is a Sentire media production, created and hosted by me, Mike Corradi, and produced by my wonderful Patreon supporters, whom I would like to thank starting with the third part of the Margherita Hack and Galileo Galilei level. And they are Neville, Niels, Paradise, Patrizia K, Peter F, Rachel, Rocco, Roberta D, Rod L, Rodney N, Rudy F, Russell, Sandra, Scott L, Sean M, Shelby, Shelley, Steve S, Stephen, and Tap Dance Down Under. And of course, we cannot forget the tippy top Maria Montessori and Dante Alighieri level. Lisa K, Andrew M, Peter W, David L, David C, J W, Sen, David A, Karen D, Helenka, Kaiser Bosch, Bridget, Dallas, and Joseph. If, like them, you'd like to have access to extra content and ad-free episodes, you can do so. Go to ahistoryofitaly.com, click on the support page, and become a Patreon supporter. You can also support us on PayPal, as James B. has recently done. Thank you very much, James, for your contribution. If you'd just like to get in touch, which would be great, hello@ahistoryofitaly.com, or you can click through to our social media from the contact page of the website, ahistoryofitaly.com. Once again, thank you very much for listening, and until next time, arrivederci.